Welcome to this explainer. Today we're talking about something absolutely crucial, a massive structural firmware update to your ethical operating system. I want you to think back for a second. Think about the very last time you had to make a genuinely tough call under intense pressure. Maybe your margins were collapsing, a competitor was playing dirty, or a key relationship was completely falling apart. Look around and you'll see we are literally living in the high-entropy pressure cooker of 2026. Things are moving impossibly fast, the stakes are incredibly high, and honestly, the margins for error are thinner than they have ever been. In this kind of unforgiving environment, you need a whole lot more than just good intentions to survive and thrive. You need verifiable logic. You need a system that doesn't just crack the second the heat gets turned up.
So I have to ask you a serious question right off the bat. Are you running your ethics on vibes? Think about it carefully. When you're totally exhausted, stressed out of your mind, and your back is completely against the wall, your vibes are almost always going to tell you to just take the easy way out. If you're relying on transient moods, tribal loyalties, or unverified emotional reactions to guide your decisions under stress, you are exposing yourself to a terminal vulnerability. We see institutions and algorithms all around us failing today for this exact reason. They lack rigorous, hard-coded ethical verification. When the stakes get high, simply relying on the feeling that you're a good person will eventually lead you to rationalize some truly bad behavior. Your vibes will absolutely betray you when you need the most. Because of that, we need to immediately move away from transient ethics. Transient ethics is basically just doing the right thing only when it's easy, when it's convenient, or when someone else happens to be watching. It's incredibly fragile. Instead, we've got to build stable ethics. This is all about maintaining fundamental fairness as a permanent, load-bearing structural feature of your life, completely regardless of the environmental noise going on around you. For a true systems architect, ethics absolutely cannot be a side constraint or an afterthought. It has to be a systemic shield. It's literally the only thing that prevents necessary strategic realism from sliding all the way down into unchecked sociopathy.
So here is our installation manual for today's explainer. We're going to start with ethics as an operating system, then move through the three hard categories of this code: obligation, permission, and prohibition. And finally, we'll wrap the whole shebang up with daily proofs and tripwires to make sure you actually keep this system running smoothly.
Okay, Section 1, Ethics as an Operating System. Let's dive right into this framework.
The first thing we have to do is stop viewing morality as mere social signaling. We have to start engineering it directly into our minds. We need a framework that takes the abstract, philosophical idea of what you ought to do and turns it into the concrete, systems engineering reality of what you absolutely must do. This brings us to the core architecture, Deontic temporal logic. Now, I know that sounds incredibly complex and academic, right? But stick with me here, because it essentially just establishes three strict, easy-to-understand categories for your behavior. It dictates exactly what you are obligated to do, what you are permitted to do, and what is strictly forbidden. When you install this clear-cut logic, your ethics remain completely stable, even when the floodwaters of fortune rise and the pressure to compromise is overwhelming.
Moving on to Section 2, Obligation, the always constraint. Let's look at the absolute foundational states of your system.
This brings us straight to Axiom 1. In this sovereign system, your absolute primary obligation is the maintenance of stable fairness. The human translation here is simple, but man, it is incredibly demanding. You are required to act with consistency over time. What does acting with consistency actually mean in a fast-paced corporate or personal environment? Well, it means fairness is not a one-time performance. You don't just act fairly when the board of directors is in the room or when you're desperately trying to close a big deal. It must be a permanent, unwavering feature of how you operate day in and day out. Consistency is the absolute bedrock of trust, and without it, your network will slowly but surely bleed out.
So how do we actually put this into practice? We use three operational rules. First, apply the always constraint. Every single strategic move you make must be relentlessly audited against long-term equilibrium. If a move gives you a quick short-term win but damages your baseline fairness, you must reject it as a systemic ruin event. It's just poison. Second, practice clear reciprocity. Set firm boundaries. Start nice, start clear, but enforce proportional consequences if someone refuses to reciprocate. Finally, own your iterative learning. If you detect a rational resentment building up, initiate a repair protocol immediately. What does that actually look like? It means pulling the person aside, explicitly acknowledging the friction and clearing the air before it metastasizes. You've got to re-engineer that feedback loop before it corrupts your entire system. Take this real-world example from the source text about a sales director. He used to nurse these quiet grudges against certain aggressive personality types on his team. And we all know how much damage a quiet grudge can do, right? It slows down communication, it creates these passive-aggressive silos, and it just completely ruins team culture. But once this director installed this obligation protocol, he started catching those emotional patterns within minutes rather than letting them fester for months. He would pause, actively remap the actual incentives of his team members, and adjust his behavior to maintain baseline fairness. Within a single quarter, his team's internal friction dropped to near zero, and their revenue results went through the roof. This totally proves that having a strict obligation to fairness isn't softness, it is absolute structural integrity.
All right, Section 3, Permission, the green zone. Now that we have our non-negotiable obligations, let's look at exactly where we are permitted to maneuver.
Welcome to Axiom 2. You are allowed to exercise raw virtue. Now, if you aren't familiar with that term, virtue basically means your bold, decisive, even ruthless drive to achieve a goal. But here's the major catch. You can only unleash that drive when the move explicitly serves a verified ethical output. Sovereignty lives exactly in this green zone. Using your power purely for vanity, just to stroke your own ego, or for blind resource extraction is completely outside the bounds of permission. You are permitted to be fierce, for sure, but only when you are fiercely protecting the mission and the common good of your network.
To verify you're truly operating in this green zone, you need to run through a quick mental checklist before acting. Step 1. Run the mission alignment trigger. Ask yourself honestly, does this aggressive move actually serve the common good or the high-trust network? If it's just for self-aggrandizement, permission is instantly denied. Step 2. Use the eventually principle. Look, sometimes you might need to wear a Machiavellian mask temporarily just to survive a highly predatory corporate hierarchy. That happens. But the system must eventually return to ethical equilibrium. Temporary noise is fine for survival, but permanent moral drift is not. Step 3. Demand explainability. If you cannot articulate the exact why of your move in plain, justifiable language, then the action is simply impermissible.
Let's look at another incredibly relevant story here. A startup founder was completely furious at a competitor and was right on the verge of launching a devastating, humiliating public call-out on social media. We've all been there, right? Wanting that quick, intoxicating hit of ego validation by destroying someone publicly. But right before hitting send, he ran the mission alignment trigger and stopped cold. He realized the move was entirely about his bruised ego, and it did absolutely nothing for his actual company mission. So he took a deep breath and chose a much quieter, cleaner path to resolve the dispute behind closed doors. Because he stayed in the green zone, he ended up gaining deep respect and way more long-term industry allies than any messy, viral public victory ever would have given him.
Next up, Section 4, Prohibition, hard red lines. We've talked about what you must do and what you may do. Now, let's talk about the absolute boundaries. This brings us to Axiom 3. You may not let personal bias, tribal loyalty, or sensitive attributes contaminate your strategic evaluation, ever. If you violate a fairness constraint by letting prejudice or favoritism make your decisions for you, representational bias creeps into your system. And make no mistake, that bias will eventually, inevitably destroy your sovereign integrity. This is a terminal vulnerability, folks. Once you cross this hard red line, you can literally no longer trust your own decision-making process.
So your defensive mechanisms here are critical to your survival. First, run the counterfactual test. When you're making a decision about a hire, a promotion, or a conflict, perform a brutal mental swap. If the person's sensitive attributes, like their race, gender, or background, changed, but their competence stayed exactly the same, would your decision change? If yes, you violated the code. Second, forbid IAT objectification. This simply means you can never treat a human being as a mere stepping stone or a consumable tool. You can never purchase a victory by stripping someone of their fundamental dignity. Finally, block tribal supernormal stimuli. Think about the engineered outrage bait we see on social media every single day. Do not let digital algorithms map your social world into an us versus them tribal war. Map people by their actual resources and verified metrics, never by cheap tribal labels.
Think about what this actually looks like in practice. There was a hiring manager who almost rejected a phenomenally strong candidate. And why? Purely due to an unconscious class bias. The candidate simply didn't come from the right corporate pedigree or use the expected corporate jargon. But the manager forced themselves to stop and run the counterfactual test.
How did that feel in the moment? Super uncomfortable. Confronting your own bias always is, but it exposed the flaw instantly. The prohibition triggered, saving the decision from being totally contaminated by snobbery. They hired the candidate, who quickly became one of their most valuable, high-performing operators. That is the exact, verifiable power of establishing a hard red line.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Daily Proofs and Tripwires. How do we make sure we actually execute all of this day to day?
We need a 3-part daily rhythm to automate this verification. Ethics aren't verified in a single grand moment. They're verified across thousands of tiny sequences. At dawn, run a morning thread audit. Sit down with your coffee, check the explainability of your planned mission for the day, and confirm your actions map to your baseline obligations. During the daylight, in the afternoon arena, you execute. You operate forcefully within the bounds of permission. You might need to be aggressive, but your inner citadel remains strictly governed by the always constraint. Finally, at dusk, perform an evening merit dedication. Honestly review the day. Where did transient bias appear? Who annoyed you? Confirm your system is actively returning to equilibrium before you go to sleep. This isn't a chore. It is an incredibly empowering daily routine.
But listen, even with a rock-solid daily routine, you still need automated hard stops. Let's look at 2 vital tripwires. Tripwire 1 is counterfactual variance. If you ever catch yourself giving a favored partner or a friend a free pass for terrible behavior that you would ruthlessly punish in a rival, boom, you've tripped the wire. The immediate script? Stop. Re-verify what is actually in your control and map the incentives without an ounce of sentimentality. Tripwire 2 is representational decay. What does this look like? It looks like endless HR meetings and drama instead of actually shipping a product. If your mission velocity is cratered because you're constantly managing interpersonal fallout, a fairness constraint was violated somewhere up the chain. The script for this? Initiate a status and apology ritual to explicitly restore trust, recalibrate the team, and get back to work.
To really see why this matters on a massive, macro scale, consider the disastrous collapse of certain algorithmic loan prediction models we've seen in the news. These multi-million-dollar systems were built without hard prohibitions against sensitive attributes. And what happened? Over time, they drifted heavily into representational bias, unfairly rejecting thousands of highly qualified people based on hidden proxies for identity. The models became fundamentally untrustworthy and basically had to be scrapped. Your personal life and career are exactly like those models. If you let environmental noise and bias bypass a strict verification framework, your systemic reputation will eventually crash. And in a highly networked society, once you lose trust, your transaction cost to get anything done will rise exponentially.
Which brings us to our final resolution. By actively adopting this code, you leave the herd behind. You leave the people whose entire concept of morality is just empty, cheap social signaling. You build a sovereign system that is structurally incapable of being corrupted by the floodwaters of fortune. You are the architect of your own mind. Your ethics are no longer something you just desperately hope to feel in the moment. They are now a verifiable, hardened logic, completely operationalized for your long-term success.
I'll leave you with this final thought to deeply consider today. Look closely at your own life, your own business, and your own operations. How will your current ethical systems actually hold up against the floodwaters of fortune when things get truly difficult? Are you going to rely on the shifting sands of vibes and transient moods? Or will you structurally implement the deontologic code to ensure you remain totally unbroken under pressure? The choice is yours. Build accordingly.